This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news recorded at 14 hours GMT on Wednesday the 7th of February. I'm Claire MacDonald with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service News today. Coming up, Chancellor Angela Merkel has reached a deal with the German Social Democrats to form a coalition government after months of political wrangling and uncertainty. This CSU politician said the recent talks had been successful.
Sie sehen uns zufrieden.
We are pleased. We said last night that we had to dig our way out of the trenches. No one can dig themselves in anymore. We had to try to resolve the conflicts in an open way.
Also in the podcast, the US Vice President has said Washington won't let North Korea hijack the Winter Olympics with propaganda.
Later this week, I will have the privilege to lead the United States delegation to the Winter Olympics, but we'll also be there to stand with our allies and remind the world that North Korea is the most tyrannical and oppressive regime on the planet.
The Autonomous Republic of Somaliland has banned the most severe forms of female genital mutilation. And later, new DNA analysis of an ancient skeleton found in Britain has discovered that its owner had dark and not light skin, throwing new light on the evolution of modern man in Europe.
It was always assumed that as soon as modern humans expand into Europe, they develop pale skin very quickly because it's more efficient at absorbing UV light and helping the body produce vitamin D.
But first, Europe's economic powerhouse is a big step closer to having a new government. More than 4 months after German federal elections, the two biggest parties have finally agreed to form a coalition. Alexander De Brint, who represented a party close to Chancellor Merkel in the talks, said they had been successful.
Sie sehen uns zufrieden.
We are pleased. We said last night that we had to dig our way out of the trenches. No one can dig themselves in anymore. We had to try to resolve the conflicts in an open way, and we've achieved that. It's about time there is the prospect of a government in Germany. So it's a good day.
Our correspondent in Berlin, Damien McGuinness, told me there's now a sense of relief in Germany.
Yeah, I think all party leaders are relieved because if they hadn't managed to have struck this deal this afternoon, the only other likely outcome would have been fresh elections or a minority government, which for Angela Merkel was something she didn't want because that was seen as generally pretty unstable. But of course, even though party leaders are now saying we have a deal, that the disagreements have been ironed out and the ministries are now being allocated, there's still one more hurdle to overcome, and that is, of course, that 450,000 Social Democrats, SPD party members will have a vote on this deal. If they vote no, then it's back to the drawing board, and it could mean fresh elections, which would mean no government until autumn possibly.
And do we know what kind of horse trading was going on behind the scenes to reach this deal? Have any policies changed on either side?
The deal itself is essentially a giveaway to both sides. So what we've seen is over the past few years, Germany has enjoyed record tax intakes. That means that in the agreement, they've managed to give lots of giveaways to all sorts of different people. We're also seeing cuts in certain sorts of taxation. But the criticism is that there's no impetus for big, grand reform. One thing that probably will come out of this, though, that's positive, is for the EU. So it looks like the finance ministry is going to the centre-left Social Democrats. And that means that the new government, if all goes well, if this deal goes ahead, the new government in Berlin will be pretty amenable to French President Emmanuel Macron's plans to reform the Eurozone and to give more German support for struggling Eurozone economies. So it's certainly good news for Paris, and the French government will be looking on this with great interest today.
It's an interesting way to run a government, isn't it? The SPD controlling 6 ministries, including finance and foreign affairs, and Angela Merkel's Conservatives overseeing other departments. How do you get any decisions made with such a fractured approach to government?
We always have coalition governments effectively, and it's not unusual to have centre-left, centre-right coalition governments. So this sort of compromise is quite common. It does mean that in Parliament you can push through quite a lot of big ideas. The disadvantage of it is, though, that the nature of this source of compromise and this consensus building means that you have to water down some of your ideologies, and that has annoyed some core voters and some grassroots supporters.
Damien McGuinness in Berlin. A verdict is due today for 5 UK nationals who took their case to court in the Netherlands in a campaign to keep their EU citizenship after Brexit. They asked a Dutch judge to press the European Court of Justice, or ECJ, to clarify their rights. If it decides to make a ruling, the ECJ could guarantee such rights as freedom of movement after the UK leaves the European Union. Anna Holligan reports.
We start in a seaside suburb of The Hague, close to the North Sea, and home to Debbie Williams, who's just brewing a fresh pot of coffee. What brought a Welsh woman like yourself to a place like this?
Work. Not my work. My husband's an IT contractor. So we go where the work is, and that's what free movement has allowed us to do.
You described it as a tragedy to lose these EU citizenship rights. Why?
It's choices. EU citizenship gives us choices. It gives us more choices. It gives us a bigger job market. I mean, that's really important. You have to earn a living without restrictions, as in needing work permits, needing visas, that sort of thing, as if you were a third country national.
Ultimately, you'll be able to do the job, won't you? Chris will be able to do the job.
Who knows? I don't know. We call it in limbo. That's what it feels like. The uncertainty causes anxiety. It stops you planning. It is a very difficult time for a lot of people.
The judge in Amsterdam will announce whether it's necessary to ask the European Court of Justice for clarity on where the law stands. The ECJ could say that all member states must uphold the European rights of British citizens in any of the respective states in which they currently reside, even after Brexit, which would potentially take the power out of the political negotiators' hands.
My clients are currently in a very insecure situation.
Christian Alberdijk Time is the Dutch lawyer representing this group of 5 British nationals.
Currently, the negotiating member states and the UK in Brussels are negotiating under the premise that UK citizens on the continent will lose your rights, and therefore they're returning some of the rights to UK citizens living on the continent. We know that you can only obtain that EU citizenship right after your country has become a member of the EU, but we don't know what happens to that right when you leave the EU. That is simply a question that hasn't been answered yet.
We're just picking up a coffee at the central station in The Hague now, as many Brits do every day. About 42,500 British nationals live in the Netherlands, including Stephen Heighton, who's originally from Merseyside.
If this was a general election and you'd voted Labour or you'd voted Liberal Democrat or if you voted Conservative and you lost the election, you lose the election. But you don't give up fighting for your principles. It's my duty and responsibility to stand up for those rights and fight hard to ensure that if Brexit's an inevitability, that at least it's done in a way that has the minimum damage to the future of the economy and to my children's future, because I don't know where they're going to be in 10 or 20 years' time. What I can say is that many of the politicians who are currently negotiating Brexit in 10 or 20 years' time, with all due respect, either won't be here or probably won't even remember what they negotiated 10 years before.
Like other Brits who've been living outside the UK for more than 15 years, Stephen was not eligible to vote in the EU referendum. Why not just apply for a Dutch citizenship and have the Dutch passport, Dutch nationality? Why not do that? And then you're guaranteeing your European citizenship rights post-Brexit without having to go through this lengthy court case.
It's an easy route out. You know, it's the same as saying, oh, you live abroad, you've got no interest in what's going on in the UK. That's not true.
That report from Anna Holligan in The Hague. South Korea says the younger sister of the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un will attend the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics in the south. Kim Yo Jong is also a close advisor to her brother, and he rarely travels outside his own country. Earlier, a group of 280 North Korean athletes, journalists and members of a cheering squad crossed by land into South Korea, one of the largest groups to cross the heavily fortified border during peacetime. The US Vice President Mike Pence has been speaking in Tokyo before he heads to Pyeongchang. He delivered this warning.
Later this week, I will have the privilege to lead the United States delegation to the Winter Olympics. We'll be there to cheer on our American athletes, but we'll also be there to stand with our allies and remind the world that North Korea is the most tyrannical and oppressive regime on the planet.
I spoke to our correspondents Laura Bicker in Pyeongchang and Rupert Wingfield-Hayes in Tokyo, who gave us the latest. First, Rupert.
I think this is a very deliberate and tough message to the Americans' allies in the region, particularly to Japan and South Korea. I think very welcome in Japan. The Japanese and US governments see eye to eye. But to South Korea, to China and to others in the region, that it is now the time is to stick together and to carry on with the strategy against North Korea. And that means sanctions, pressure, squeezing the North Korean regime, and that the US and Japan believe that this is working. And there are signs of that. You can see them from Kim Jong-un's New Year's speech, in which he called these sanctions life-threatening. And we can see it, as far as the Americans and the Japanese think, we can see it with this North Korean charm offensive around the Olympics. So I think Mike Pence was basically saying North Korea is feeling the pressure, and now is not the time for the US and any of its allies to back off.
Laura, it's a historical move sending his younger sister in the way that he has, a blood relation who's very high up in his government. What do we know about her?
Yeah, it's been a huge surprise. There was a bit of speculation that she might be part of the delegation, but few thought it would actually happen. Now, you're right, she's the first immediate Kim family member to cross the border. She's one of his Kim Jong-un's closest aides. He is thought to trust her. She was part of the ruling Workers' Party propaganda department, and she's been promoted up to the political bureau of the party. That brings her closer to the centre of power in Pyongyang. But it's worth remembering that she's also on the US blacklist. Now that means she can't travel to the US. It doesn't prevent her travelling to South Korea. But the US subjected her to sanctions because of what they saw as human rights abuses. So she is on this US blacklist. Now what we understand right now is that the South Korean government is speaking to the US because they do not want to have this political problem on the Olympics opening ceremony day. So they're speaking to the US about her travelling here. But right now, what we understand is that she would travel on the 9th, and that's, again, we're not sure of her schedule, but she would travel on the 9th. And we're hearing not exactly that she'll attend the opening ceremony, because that's yet to be confirmed, but she'll certainly be part of that Olympic delegation.
Laura Bicker in South Korea and Rupert Wingfield-Hayes in Tokyo. Now to Taiwan, and as we record this podcast, more than 80 people, including some foreign tourists, remain unaccounted for after a 6.4 magnitude quake struck the city of Hualien. 6 people have died and hundreds have been injured. From Taiwan, Cindy Su reports.
Taiwanese people are used to earthquakes, but this one shocked many. It forced several buildings to near complete collapse. The quake shook many people out of bed. They scrambled to save those still inside. More than 100 people were rescued by residents, firefighters, and soldiers. Miraculously, an employee of a hotel was found alive and hardly injured after being trapped for 15 hours on a collapsed floor. But many remained unaccounted for, more than 12 hours after the quake struck. Some of them are feared to be tourists staying at a backpackers' hotel on the 2nd floor of the building. It was crushed along with 4 other lower floors. Others are believed to be residents who may not have been home at the time. More than a dozen quakes and aftershocks shook Hualien after the initial earthquake, complicating rescue efforts. This one struck as an eyewitness spoke to the BBC.
Oh my God, this is an aftershock, I'm sorry.
Oh my goodness.
Oh my God.
My goodness.
So we Yeah, so we're told to just go to the road and stay in the road. But yeah, we're having a few aftershocks. This is maybe our 7th of the hour.
Without knowing how many people may be trapped, President Tsai Ing-wen urged rescuers to race against time to find survivors. Her government has pledged $10 billion to help victims. But that may be little comfort for Taiwan, an island that sits at the junction of two tectonic plates and is frequently rocked by earthquakes, with 100 recorded just in this month.
Cindy Su in Taiwan. The authorities in the self-declared Republic of Somaliland have issued a religious edict banning some forms of female genital mutilation. The Ministry of Religious Affairs said anyone caught performing the operation would be punished and that the girls being circumcised would receive compensation depending on the extent of the wound. I asked our Africa editor Mary Harper, who knows Somaliland well, if this edict is a big development.
It is. The World Health Organization estimates that about 98% of Somali women undergo a particularly severe form of female genital mutilation. And so this religious edict is a massive development for the women in that territory. So many of them have very severe problems with menstruation, urination and childbirth because of having basically their external genitalia removed and then they're sewn up. So it's tremendously difficult for them to get by in their daily lives. So this is really going to transform women's lives if indeed it is implemented.
And there's lots of changes going on in Somaliland at the moment. Where has this pressure come for a change to the law?
Yes, there's been a huge amount of pressure from women, especially really in the diaspora where they feel more able to talk about it. There's hundreds of thousands of Somali refugees scattered all over the world because of the successive conflicts the region has gone under. So you have a lot of pressure from the diaspora. You also have women's groups in Somaliland itself. And also the territory has recently got a new president who's much more proactive. He's already taken steps against rape. And this is the next stage in his campaign to try to maybe bring a very traditional society into the modern world.
It's now illegal, but how possible will it be to enforce it?
I think it's going to be very difficult. Somaliland has a very weak government. It's a nomadic territory with people moving around all the time. One of the ministers says they were going to set up neighbourhood watch committees to try to oversee the implementation of this edict. But I think it's going to take probably months, indeed years, for real change to take place.
Our Africa editor, Mary Harper. You're listening to Global News, the most important stories and the best interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. Every weekend you can hear a review of the week's main news stories and why they matter. That's in the world this week. And the programme is also available to download from our website. Go to www.bbc.co.uk/programmes. Now to South Africa, where the Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa says he is in direct talks with President Jacob Zuma and that a decision about his future will be reached in the coming days. Mr. Zuma is facing allegations of corruption and refuses to stand down, even though key figures in his party want him to. Andrew Harding reports.
President Zuma has spent the morning in meetings here in Cape Town. It's believed he's still discussing the terms of his much-anticipated resignation. Mr. Zuma is facing multiple corruption charges, but an amnesty is not on the table. South Africans are waiting for a breakthrough with some anxiety after days of confusion and the unprecedented postponement of this week's State of the Nation address. The ANC is now bitterly divided after 2 decades in power. The party's new leader, Cyril Ramaphosa, needs to handle Mr. Zuma's exit quickly but delicately if he's to emerge from this awkward standoff in a position of strength.
Andrew Harding. The British multinational Tesco is facing a possible bill of $5.5 billion as a result of the UK's biggest ever equal pay claim. Lawyers say thousands of hourly paid women working in Tesco supermarket stores are earning less than male employees, even though the value of the work is comparable. Tesco, which has stores across Europe and Asia, is Britain's biggest retailer. Here's our economics editor, Kamal Ahmed.
Tesco has joined a long list of organisations facing controversies over equal pay. Among retailers, Asda and Sainsbury's are facing similar legal battles. Birmingham City Council has already agreed to more than £1 billion of payments for women cleaners and carers, and the BBC has been accused of not paying men and women equally. Tesco, as one of the country's largest employers, is now facing a series of test cases which could lead to the largest equal pay claim in employment history. Lawyers acting for Tesco supermarket workers said that female staff on hourly rates earn considerably less than men, even though the value of the work is comparable. Kim Element has worked for Tesco for 23 years.
I think that although we think we have equal rights, there are times where there are such discrepancies that you can't explain them. And I think Tesco's are just one of many companies that really aren't addressing the fact that women seem to still be paid less for the same work.
Tesco said that all their staff could progress equally and were paid fairly, whatever their gender or background.
Our economics editor, Kamal Ahmed. Now, is your job about to become obsolete because of automation? Well, the answer to that question depends a lot on what job you do, the sector it's in, and the part of the world you live in. That is according to a new analysis by the professional services firm PwC, which breaks the automation revolution down into three distinct but overlapping waves. They are the algorithm wave, the augmentation wave, and finally, the autonomy wave. Dan Damon has been finding out more from PwC's chief economist, John Hawksworth.
The key thing that we're looking at is the macroeconomic impact of automation, and we see that this is going to bring large benefits to the economy in the long term, perhaps 10% or so to economies like the UK, and will probably create as many jobs as it displaces. So there will be many jobs created, both in the technology sector, directly in terms of these sort of new innovations, but also because it will generate extra income and wealth, and as that's spent and invested in the economy, that will generate demand for labour in sectors that are less easy to automate. So the net effect may be broadly neutral, but nevertheless it will be quite disruptive, as previous industrial revolutions have been, and therefore you will get quite a lot of displacement of jobs and also creation of jobs.
It's not as simple, is it, that those who do routine jobs will find them replaced by machines? Different types of people, different genders of people are going to be affected.
Yeah, and we see a number of sort of overlapping waves of automation. The first wave is probably going to be focused more on people that are dealing with pure data analysis. We already see this in some sectors in the past with clerical jobs going, but I think we can see this moving into other areas in financial services, in information communications.
Law?
Could be in some of the tasks of actually scanning through very large numbers of cases and trying to extract information. Although that can also create new opportunities because it can open up new fields of investigation that lawyers can then work with the machines, if you like, to enhance the services they can offer to clients. So, yes, I think many of these professional services could also be affected in this first wave. Later on, I think it could affect different types of routine tasks that are more linked to manual labour, but that requires a longer time period than maybe 10, 15, 20 years to develop robotics and other sort of technologies, which are still more at the prototype stage at this point.
Is that the autonomy phase that you're talking about?
That's what we talk about, the autonomy phase, which we don't really think will mature until well into the 2030s based on...
Which is machines doing their own thing.
Which is machines being able to move around in the world, take in information from the world and make decisions, take actions, learn from things, much in the way that, a human child is doing, it's learning to walk, and as we do every day walking around in the street. I think we're still quite a way away from that, but I think it's at that point that it starts to affect not just things like driverless vehicles, but also manual jobs in construction sites and retail and other sorts of areas.
And by the time we get there, you're saying actually women will do better than men. Female employees will be less affected.
Yes, I think in the early stages where it's more of a focus on things like clerical tasks, we just find, as a matter of fact, that those sort of jobs tend to be done disproportionately by women rather than men, so they may be more hit. But as we get to this later stage of autonomy, when you get into things like driverless trucks, more manufacturing jobs, heavy lifting jobs in warehouses and things like this, then that tends to be areas where male employment tends to dominate, and so men may be more exposed to this in the longer term.
John Hawksworth, PwC's chief economist. New DNA analysis of an ancient skeleton found in Britain has discovered that its owner had dark and not light skin. It was originally assumed that Cheddar Man, who appeared in Britain about 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age, had light skin but dark eyes. Dan Damon spoke to Dr. Tom Booth, a bioarchaeologist at the Natural History Museum in London, who was part of the team that made the discovery.
It looks like that based on his genetics that he doesn't have the genes that are associated with lighter skin pigmentation in modern white Europeans. So it's likely they would have had dark skin, but he does have the gene for blue eyes and then dark curly hair.
Does that tell you where he came from?
Not really, in a sense, because from other work that's been done on ancient Europeans from around Europe, pretty much the whole population of Europe looked like this at this time around 10,000 years ago. What we do know is that the population to which it belongs moves into Europe and appears in Europe around 14,000 years ago and mostly replaces the population that was there before them. And it seems as though that they have actually moved out of the Near East and that that's the most likely origin for the population as a whole.
So did Cheddaman come from the Near East?
Cheddaman himself didn't know. He would have been born and raised probably in the local area, but the population to which he belonged had moved into Europe and then Britain from the Near East a few thousand years earlier.
And what this also, I guess, doesn't really tell you is why skin pigmentation changes in the way it does.
Yeah, so it was always assumed that as soon as modern humans expand into Europe, they develop pale skin very quickly because it's more efficient at absorbing UV light and helping the body produce vitamin D. However, this seems to sort of run counter to that because it looks like the Europeans maintained dark skin for 30,000 years after they first arrived. And actually, the first genes that were associated with pale skin in white Europeans arrive as a result of migration from outside of Europe. But those migrations were actually migrations of farmers. So what the current thinking on why pale skin occurs is actually that when you're farming you have a much more restricted diet than when you're hunter-gathering, and that the hunter-gatherers were getting their vitamin D from the diet, whereas the farmers weren't getting it from the dietary sources, so they adapted pale skin to kind of compensate for that.
So Cheddaman wasn't living on cheese. What was he living on?
He was living on giant cows, giant wild cows called aurochs, wild boar, red deer probably, and some riverine fish.
And you've identified that he died in his 20s. How was that in those days? Was that a reasonably good age?
I think that probably actually that was quite young. We're not quite sure about how he died. Some people suggested that he died quite a violent death, but the evidence there is a bit shaky. But I would imagine that people were living to the 30s and usually to the 40s at this period.
And what did he live in? A hut?
Yeah, it was probably some kind of portable skin tent, so the populations would have been relatively mobile around this period. We have no evidence of people, despite the stereotypes of Stone Age people, we have no evidence of people living in caves, although they did seem to bury the dead in caves.
And was there anything left, apart from of him, of the things that he used or the dwelling that he inhabited?
Not with him specifically, but we have a lot of other evidence from Britain at this period of other things. So we have evidence of monumental structures that the people that Cheddaman belonged to built in the landscape of Stonehenge. We have evidence for these elaborate ritual structures in places like Starcar in Yorkshire, these big wooden walkways and buildings essentially, and these ritual headdresses made out of red deer skulls. So we have quite a good idea of the ritual lives that these people lived.
Dr. Tom Booth from the Natural History Museum in London. Now, the world's most powerful rocket, the SpaceX Falcon Heavy, is heading towards outer space after a near-flawless blast-off from Cape Canaveral in Florida. The Falcon Heavy was dreamed up by the billionaire Elon Musk. The newsroom's Jonathan Savage has the story.
A cherry-red, open-top sports car floating in space with the Earth, a blue-grey sphere in the far, far distance. Behind the wheel, a spaceman, or at least a passable mannequin. And if you were setting off on an elliptical orbit as far as the planet Mars, what else would you have on the stereo?
Ground control to Major Tom. You've really made the grade.
It's a spectacular scene with a purpose. For this test launch, rather than carrying a valuable cargo, the billionaire SpaceX and Tesla CEO Elon Musk felt he could afford to send one of his own cars into space instead. When the launch went off without a hitch, there was relief and delight at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
This was a groundbreaking launch. The Falcon Heavy is the most powerful space vehicle since NASA's shuttle program. The rocket costs just a third of its nearest rival, but can carry more than double its payload. Even its booster rockets are designed to be reused. 2 of the 3 touched back down on Earth as planned. 1 crashed into the sea. So what could all this mean for our future in space? Much bigger satellites, more ambitious trips for robots to explore faraway planets, and as Elon Musk says, all this with much greater frequency.
Seeing the two boosters land synchronized, really just like the simulation, I mean, it makes me think that could be quite a scalable approach. You could imagine large numbers of those coming in, landing, taking off, landing, doing many flights per day.
Sadly, for those hoping to join the dummy astronaut on a trip around the sun, plans to make the Falcon Heavy a tourist experience have been withdrawn. But a different rocket is being developed that might one day carry passengers, most likely for an astronomical fee.
Jonathan Savage with the story of the Falcon Heavy. And that is all from us for now, but an updated version of the Global News podcast will be available for you to download later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can just send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Claire McDonald, and until next time, goodbye.